So up to 70% of major corporate change initiatives just entirely fail. I mean, that is a staggering statistic when you consider the millions of dollars and honestly thousands of hours poured into strategy formulation.
Yeah, it really is. And you can hire the sharpest consultants in the world, right?
Mm.
Build this flawless financial model,
Right.
and you draw up a strategic roadmap that looks like a work of absolute genius when you're just sitting in the boardroom. But, the second you try to actually implement that brilliant strategy, it hits a brick wall.
Exactly. And that wall is made of human beings.
It's the ultimate paradox of management, really. Because strategy formulation, it's often an exercise in logic and mathematics. It's clean, right?
Yeah, spreadsheets are very clean. People, not so much.
Exactly. Strategy implementation, the actual behavioral execution of the thing, is undeniably messy.
Mm.
You are no longer dealing with spreadsheets. You're dealing with psychology, entrenched habits, conflicting interests, and, institutional momentum.
Which is why, if you are listening to this right now, you are likely deep into your MBA prep, just staring down the barrel of exams that demand you understand not just how to build a strategy, but how to actually make an organization swallow it and survive.
Right. That's the key. Surviving the change.
And that is our mission for this deep dive. We're exploring that massive chasm between the theoretical perfection of a plan and the muddy reality of behavioral implementation.
We're going to unpack the architecture of change, the psychological leverage required from leadership, and the ethical guardrails that basically keep the whole thing from going off a cliff.
Yeah, let's keep it on the road if we can.
But we have to start by recognizing that the battlefield itself, meaning the organizational structure, really dictates how this implementation is going to unfold. Before you even look at the people, you have to look at the environment.
Okay, so lay out the environment for us. What does that look like?
But in highly stable, predictable industries, legacy utilities or traditional manufacturing organizations naturally evolve into what we call tall structures.
Tall meaning lots of managers.
Exactly. They develop multiple layers of management, really rigorous hierarchies, and narrow spans of control. The environment basically allows them the luxury of bureaucracy.
Right, because tomorrow is probably going to look a whole lot like yesterday. You don't need to pivot your entire business model in 24 hours, so, you can afford to have decisions move slowly up and down a huge chain of command.
Precisely. But if you're in a dynamic environment like a tech startup or maybe a legacy company that's suddenly facing massive digital disruption, that tall structure becomes a tomb.
Oh, wow. A tomb. That's a strong word.
It is, but it's true. You see companies frantically trying to become SLAT. They just strip out the middle management layers to widen the span of control. They literally have to be flat to be fast.
So the structure is essentially just a biological adaptation to the speed of their market.
That's a great way to put it. And that brings us to the core of behavioral implementation. Whether you are navigating a tall hierarchy or a flat matrix, the structure is entirely populated by people who have their own agendas.
Right, nobody's just a gear in a machine.
Exactly. So to successfully execute a strategy, you have to master 5 distinct pillars for your exams: stakeholder management, strategic leadership, corporate culture, ethics, and corporate social responsibility, or CSR.
And these aren't just isolated chapters you can memorize separately. They form this interlocking ecosystem, right? If you fail at one, the entire strategy collapses.
100%.
So let's step into that ecosystem. The first pillar is the chessboard itself. You really cannot execute a strategy if you don't know who's on the board. We're talking about stakeholder management.
And the definition here is broader than most people think, especially going into an MBA program. We aren't just talking about the people sitting in the C-suite or the shareholders holding the stock.
No, not at all. So who else is on the board?
A stakeholder is fundamentally any individual, group, or organization that can affect or is affected by the firm's decisions. It's a reciprocal relationship. And that list expands rapidly once you actually map it out.
Right, because it encompasses the employees on the factory floor, the suppliers providing the raw materials, the distributors,
Government
regulators, the media, and even the local communities where the business physically operates.
Yeah, and there is a massive philosophical distinction here that is crucial to grasp for your exams. There's this old school mindset that says the only stakeholder that matters is the shareholder. Maximize shareholder value at all costs.
But shareholders, by definition, are only maximizing value for themselves, right? They just want a return on their financial investment.
Exactly. A modern, sustainable strategy requires maximizing value for all stakeholders, Because if you only optimize for the shareholder, you eventually cannibalize the rest of the business.
I mean, that makes sense. If you squeeze your suppliers to the point of bankruptcy just to bump up a quarterly dividend, your supply chain completely breaks and the shareholders lose anyway.
Right. Or if you ignore the local community and pollute the river to save on waste disposal, the government shuts you down. True accountability means balancing the demands of customers, suppliers, government, employees, and owners simultaneously.
I always picture this dynamic like gravity in a solar system. The company is the sun, and every stakeholder is a planet or a moon in orbit, and every single one of them is exerting a gravitational pull on the company's strategy.
That's a really good analogy.
Right, because the employees are pulling toward higher compensation, the shareholders are pulling toward higher profit margins, the community is pulling toward lower emissions. So if all these planets are pulling in different directions, how does a firm keep its strategy from just being ripped apart by those forces?
Well, it requires a really rigorous, almost clinical system of management.
Yeah.
You cannot just rely on intuition to balance that gravity. There's a specific 5-step framework designed to map and control that pull.
Okay, let's get into the nuts and bolts of that framework. What's step one?
The first phase is pure intelligence gathering. It's stakeholder identification. You have to map the entire system. You catalog every internal and external party touched by the business. You literally physically create a stakeholder map so there are no invisible planets pulling you off course.
But identifying them isn't enough, right? Because a massive institutional investor doesn't have the same gravitational pull as, like, a single local blogger. They might both be in the solar system, but they aren't the same size.
Which leads directly to step 2, stakeholder analysis. This is where you dissect the psychology and power dynamics. You identify their specific needs, their hidden concerns, their actual wants, which, by the way, are often very different from their stated needs and their level of authority.
Oh, that's a good point. Stated needs versus actual wants.
Yeah, it's huge. You also look at common relationships here. Are your suppliers talking to your distributors? You are basically mapping the alliances and the leverage points.
Okay, so I've got this massive dossier on everyone involved. I know what they want and how much power they have. But practically speaking, an executive team cannot give equal time and energy to 50 different stakeholder groups. How do you actually operationalize all this intelligence?
You build a stakeholder matrix. This is the third step. You plot every stakeholder on a grid based on their level of influence and the impact they have on the strategy.
And this matrix basically dictates your resource allocation, right?
Exactly. A high-influence, high-impact stakeholder like, say, a primary regulatory body in a heavily scrutinized industry goes into a quadrant that requires constant proactive management.
Right.
But a low-influence, low-impact stakeholder gets monitored, but they don't get, daily phone calls from the CEO. You prioritize the gravity.
That makes the engagement process far more efficient. And speaking of engagement, when leadership actually sits down with these high-priority stakeholders, let's say it's a critical labor union before a massive operational pivot, what is the actual goal of that initial engagement? Because step 4 is engagement, right?
Yes, step 4 is stakeholder engagement.
It just feels like the instinct would be to dive right into the negotiations and solve the problem.
And that instinct is precisely why so many negotiations fail.
Wait, really?
Yeah. At the executive level, the initial stakeholder engagement is intentionally not about problem solving. You do not try to develop project requirements or establish specific roles right out of the gate.
If you aren't solving the problem, what is the point of the meeting?
You are building the container for the problem solving. The focus is on understanding mutual priorities and agreeing upon expectations of communication. More importantly, you are establishing a shared set of values and principles that all parties will abide by during the upcoming friction.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Because if you try to solve a complex supply chain disruption before you've agreed on whether, transparency or speed is the primary shared value, the negotiation will just devolve into chaos. You have to establish the ground rules of engagement first.
That is profound. You are basically negotiating the way you will negotiate. And then I imagine the final piece, step 5, is setting up the actual plumbing of how information flows based on those ground rules.
You got it. Step 5 is communicating information. It removes the ambiguity. Who receives what communication? When do they receive it? Through what channels? And to what level of detail?
Which inherently requires establishing strict protocols around security and confidentiality, I would assume.
Absolutely. A publicly traded company cannot share forward-looking strategic data with a community group the same way it does with its board of directors. The communication architecture has to be absolutely airtight.
So that is the chessboard. We know the players, we've measured their influence, we've set the rules of engagement, but a chessboard doesn't play itself.
No, it does not.
You need a grandmaster moving the pieces, adjusting to the environment, and pushing the organization forward. Which brings us to our second pillar, strategic leadership.
Leadership is fundamentally the art of influencing people to strive willingly and enthusiastically toward the achievement of a shared purpose. But we really have to draw a hard line here between managerial leadership and strategic leadership.
Because confusing the two is pretty much a fatal error in implementation. Let's break that down. Because in daily corporate life, we tend to use manager and leader totally interchangeably.
We do, but they are very different. Managerial leadership is inherently focused on the short term. It's operational, it is concerned with daily efficiency, keeping processes running smoothly, and putting out immediate fires. It is vital, obviously, but it's not strategic.
So what makes leadership strategic then?
Strategic leadership requires lifting your head above the day-to-day operations. It's about establishing the overarching direction of the firm, developing a coherent vision, aligning the corporate culture to that vision, modeling ethical standards, and most crucially, initiating radical changes when the environment demands it.
It seems like the difference between navigating a ship and designing the actual course. But here's where I get skeptical, and I know a lot of students do too. You read about communicating a vision and embracing change, and it can sound incredibly abstract, like a motivational poster in a break room.
Right, the jargon gets in the way.
Is embracing change an actual actionable job description? What does a strategic leader do on a Tuesday at 10 a.m. to embrace change?
It is intensely actionable, and honestly, it is a grueling full-time job. Leading strategic change breaks down into 6 specific, interdependent activities. It is not about giving one good speech at a retreat. It is a relentless structural effort.
Okay, walk me through the architecture of that effort. What is the first activity?
First is clarifying strategic intent. This isn't just sending an email saying, hey, we need to increase market share. It is about constructing a vivid, compelling picture of the destination. A leader must articulate exactly where the strategy is taking the organization so clearly that employees can actually see their own role in that future.
Because without clarity, you just cannot generate motivation.
That's exactly.
So, second would be setting the direction, which is formulating the actual mechanics of the corporate and business strategies to reach that destination. You have the vision, now you need the vehicle.
And then you hit the hardest part. Activity 3, building the organization. When a strategy shifts, the organization's current shape is usually entirely wrong for the new environment. Leaders have to rebuild the structure to align with the new needs.
And that means actively confronting and dismantling resistance to change. How do you practically dismantle resistance? Because people don't resist change because they are evil. They resist because change threatens their competence, their status, or even just their daily routine.
That's a really empathetic way to look at it, and it's accurate. You dismantle it by empowering managers deep within the organization. You push authority as far down the hierarchy as possible.
So giving them actual control.
Right. When middle managers have the autonomy to make decisions, they stop resisting the change and start owning it. The strategic leader also has to hunt down coordination problems, secure personal commitments from key players, and stay deeply connected to the reality on the ground. You cannot build an organization from a corner office. You have to know where the actual bottlenecks are.
Which leads to activity 4, and this is a massive one, shaping organizational culture. We are going to dedicate our entire next section to this, but it's worth noting here that reshaping shared values and beliefs consumes an astronomical amount of a strategic leader's time.
It does. You are basically trying to change the personality of a collective group of thousands of people.
Yeah.
It is exhausting work.
So what's activity 5?
Activity 5 focuses on the mechanism of that ongoing adaptation, creating a learning organization. Because a strategy isn't a static document. The environment is going to shift again. A learning organization is engineered to adapt quickly.
I feel like learning organization is another one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot. Does that just mean everyone has a professional development budget?
Not at all. It is a structural capacity. It involves 5 elements. It requires inspiring people with a purpose, so they actually want to learn. It requires empowering employees at all levels to experiment.
Which means letting them fail sometimes.
Exactly. It also demands a robust system for accumulating and sharing internal knowledge. If marketing learns a vital lesson, R&D needs to know about it instantly. It involves aggressively gathering external intelligence. And finally, it requires a culture that actively challenges the status quo to stimulate creativity.
Because if challenging the boss gets you fired, you do not have a learning organization. You just have a compliance organization.
Well said. And the sixth and final activity is instilling ethical behavior.
Oh.
And this seems to rest entirely on the concept of modeling.
Right. If the leader's ethical orientation is compromised, the entire organization just rots from the head down.
Ethics cannot be delegated to the HR department. Ethical behavior must start with the strategic leader. If the leader cuts corners to hit a quarterly target, the implicit message sent to every single employee is that the rules don't matter when the pressure is on.
Yeah. So we have these 6 activities: clarifying intent, setting direction, building the organization, shaping culture, creating a learning environment, and instilling ethics. But the style in which a leader executes these activities can radically alter the outcome, right?
Oh, absolutely. The framework categorizes leadership approaches into 3 distinct types for your exams. Let's start with the baseline. Transactional leadership.
Okay. What does that look like?
Transactional leaders are the masters of the status quo. They're exceptionally good at clarifying roles, outlining task requirements, initiating structure, and providing appropriate rewards. They manage the exchange. You give me effort, I give you pay and status.
So they are fair-minded, hardworking, and tolerant. They keep the trains running on time.
Exactly. They rely on the authority of their position. They focus on schedules, budgets, and plans. If your strategy relies on steady, incremental performance improvement in a stable market, a transactional leader is exactly what you need.
But if your environment requires a massive pivot, transactional leadership is going to fail, isn't it? Because it doesn't generate dramatic change.
It will completely fail. For that, you need the second approach, transformational leadership. These leaders do not rely on tangible rules and incremental incentives. They focus on intangible qualities like shared values, profound ideas, and a compelling vision.
So they aren't managing the transaction, they are managing the relationship.
Yes, they actively encourage their followers to question the status quo, which, frankly, a transactional leader would view as insubordination. Transformational leaders lead the change in mission, strategy, and culture. They drive innovation because they make it safe to challenge the old ways of working.
That sounds ideal for a pivot, but there is a third category, isn't there? Which is perhaps the most volatile and powerful.
There is charismatic and visionary leadership. This goes beyond even transformational leadership. The text describes charisma as a fire that ignites followers' energy and commitment. It produces results far beyond the standard call of duty.
A fire. That is an incredibly vivid way to describe a corporate dynamic. It implies a level of emotional devotion where followers are willing to transcend their own self-interest, maybe working insane hours or taking massive career risks simply because they believe in the leader.
That's exactly what it is. Visionary leaders have a unique capacity to articulate an attractive, ideal future that feels credible, even if it isn't readily attainable. They speak directly to the hearts of their followers.
They offer a sense of belonging to a profound mission.
Right. When a charismatic visionary leader tackles an organizational crisis, their belief is so absolute that it makes the future tangible for everyone else.
But there is a danger there, isn't there? A charismatic leader with a brilliant vision might walk into an organization ready to set the world on fire. But if the company's existing environment is completely hostile to that vision, the strategy will just die. It will.
You can have the greatest seed in the world, but if you plant it in toxic soil, nothing grows.
Which is the absolute perfect transition to our third pillar, corporate culture and strategy fit. We are moving from the leader to the atmosphere they must operate within.
I love how the concept of corporate culture is framed here. It's basically an organization's personality. Just like an individual's personality dictates how they react to stress, how they communicate, and what they value, a corporation's culture is a set of shared assumptions and beliefs that govern how the members of the firm behave.
And that personality has really deep historical roots. It almost always originates with a founder or an early, highly influential leader. Their personal beliefs get codified into the company's DNA.
Right. It gets written into policies, it forms the basis of operating practices, and over time it just becomes self-perpetuating. You see this play out in everyday corporate life. New employees arrive and immediately sense the unwritten rules. They hear the corporate stories, the legends of, the salesperson who stayed up for 3 days to close a deal, or the engineer who told off the CEO and was promoted for their honesty.
These stories signal what is actually rewarded. Culture manifests in attitudes, core values, office politics, how problems are solved, and the literal physical atmosphere of the workplace.
But here is the central dilemma for behavioral implementation. What happens when your new strategy is in direct opposition to that deeply ingrained personality?
Uh-oh. That sounds like a car crash.
It is. Corporate culture has an intense spring-back resistance to change. Its entire function is to preserve stable relationships and historical patterns of behavior. People become emotionally attached to the familiar. If a strategy conflicts with the culture will win every single time.
So if a new CEO is brought in to pivot a bureaucratic, slow-moving legacy company into an agile, digital-first powerhouse, and the culture resists, did they just surrender? I mean, how do you actually rewire the personality of an entire organization?
It is arguably the most difficult task in management. It requires concerted, relentless action, and it requires great power. You cannot shift a deeply entrenched culture from the middle of the pack. The power to overcome that springback resistance normally resides only at the very top of the executive hierarchy.
Okay, so if you are at the top, there is a 4-step diagnostic process for tackling a problem culture. Step 1 is almost clinical, right?
Yes. Step 1. Identify the facets of the present culture that are strategy supportive and ruthlessly identify those that are not. You have to know exactly which behaviors are holding you back.
Step 2 requires immense clarity. You must clearly define the desired new behaviors and specify the key features of the new culture.
Because you cannot simply tell an organization to be more innovative. You have to define exactly what innovation looks like in daily practice. Does it mean launching a prototype in 30 days instead of 6 months? You have to make it tangible.
That makes a lot of sense. Step 3 is about transparency. You have to talk openly about the problems of the present culture. You have to connect the dots for the organization, showing them exactly how the old behaviors are damaging performance and how the new behaviors will lead to success.
And step 4 is where the real work begins. Follow up with visible, aggressive actions to modify the culture. Talk is cheap. The culture only shifts when it sees consequences.
Now, this is highly testable material. There are 8 specific measures, a mix of symbolic and substantive actions that leaders use to build a strategy-supportive culture. Let's dig into these, because this is the actual toolkit for change.
Let's do it. Measure number 1. Emphasize key themes or dominant values repeatedly. Leaders must use every internal communication channel to reinforce why the cultural change is necessary for survival and growth. Repetition is vital.
Measure 2 is narrative. Stories and legends. Humans are just wired for storytelling. Leaders need to actively circulate new anecdotes that highlight the new basic beliefs. If you want a culture of customer obsession, you need a highly visible story about an employee going to absurd lengths to help a customer, and you need to tell that story at every all-hands meeting.
Exactly. Measure 3. Rewards. This is perhaps the most substantive action. You must visibly praise and generously reward the people who display the new cultural norms.
Right, because if you claim to value teamwork, but you still give the biggest bonus to the lone wolf salesperson who alienates everyone else, the culture knows you are lying. You have to align the compensation structure with the new values.
Perfectly said. Measure 4 is about the gatekeeping, recruiting and hiring. You can't just train the old guard, you have to inject new blood. You must recruit managers and employees who naturally possess the desired cultural traits. If you want an agile culture, you hire people who have thrived in ambiguity.
Measure 5. Revising policies and procedures. The literal rule book of the company must support the new culture. If you want a culture of speed and autonomy, but your expense policy still requires 3 levels of signature for a $50 software license, your policy is actively fighting your culture.
It's just constant friction. Measure 6 is my absolute favorite because of how visceral it is. Leading by example. The symbolic power of an executive's behavior is massive.
Yeah, if a company's strategy is built on low-cost leadership, meaning the entire competitive advantage is based on keeping costs bone-deep lean, the senior management cannot operate like royalty.
Exactly. The executives must visibly demonstrate that lean mentality. They should have inexpensive decorations in their offices, conservative expense accounts, and virtually no executive perks.
Right.
If you ask the factory floor to optimize every penny while the executive team is flying on private jets, the hypocrisy will breed a toxic resentment that destroys the culture entirely.
Measure 7 utilizes ceremonial events. You design specific functions to honor the individuals and groups who are exemplifying the new norms. You create rituals around the new culture.
And finally, measure 8, group gatherings. Top management must actively participate in employee training programs and company-wide meetings to stress the strategic priorities and the ethical principles. The executives must be physically present in the trenches, reinforcing the message.
So using those 8 tools, a powerful leader can slowly bend the culture of their own organization. But the complexity multiplies exponentially when we talk about mergers and acquisitions.
Oh, M&A is a whole different beast.
Managing culture clash in M&A is notoriously difficult.
Right.
What happens when 2 entirely different corporate personalities are forced to share the same body?
It is a high-risk scenario. The assumption that 2 successful firms can simply be smashed together into the same reporting structure is incredibly dangerous. The greater the gap between the 2 cultures, the higher the likelihood of a mass exodus.
People just leave.
Oh yeah. The executives and top talent in the acquired firm will simply quit, draining the very value the acquiring company just paid for.
So how does a strategic leader manage that integration and actually preserve the value?
There are 4 specific methods for handling 2 distinct cultures during a merger for your exams. The first method is integration. This is a delicate balancing act where the separate cultures of both firms are merged to create a new hybrid culture. It requires preserving the best elements of both and requires a ton of mutual respect.
The second is assimilation. In this scenario, the acquired firm willingly surrenders its own culture and adopts the culture of the acquiring firm.
Right, and this usually happens when the acquired firm was struggling and they view the acquiring firm's culture as superior or just necessary for survival.
The third method is separation. This is essentially creating a structural firewall. The 2 companies' cultures remain structurally separated. There is virtually no cultural exchange. The acquiring company provides capital or back-end support, but leaves the acquired company's culture entirely alone.
And the fourth method is the most brutal: deculturation. This is the forceful, aggressive imposition of the acquiring firm's culture onto the acquired firm. It ignores resistance.
Wow. And I'm guessing that has some fallout.
It predictably results in massive confusion, intense conflict, resentment, and stress. It is a cultural hostile takeover. It can work, but the collateral damage to morale and human capital is usually severe.
Which brings us to a critical philosophical pivot in our discussion. We've established that strategic leaders have to wield immense power to break down resistance, reshape culture, or force deculturation. But power without boundaries is tyranny.
That's right.
What prevents a visionary leader from crossing the line into ruthless exploitation? This is our fourth pillar: personal values and ethics.
Ethics provide the boundary conditions for strategic implementation. They are the discipline dealing with what is good and bad, with moral duty and obligation. They are the moral principles that govern an individual's or an organization's behavior, dictating what is fair and unfair in decision-making.
I view ethics as the underlying operating system of a corporation. You have all these different applications running simultaneously. Marketing is running campaigns, finance is running models, operations is managing supply chains. But the ethical framework is the OS that unifies them all.
I like that. It provides a common frame of reference for everyone. It defines not just what the company does, but what it fundamentally stands for.
And when that operating system crashes, the results are catastrophic. We have seen the fallout in massive corporate scandals, companies like Enron, Tyco, or Texaco. When an organization lacks a robust ethical culture, the probability of an ethical crisis skyrockets.
And the cost of an ethical crisis is existential. It isn't just the regulatory fines, which, let's be real, can be in the billions. It is the reputational annihilation. Customers leave, suppliers sever ties, and perhaps most damagingly, the human capital evaporates. The best talent in the world will not work for a company that forces them to compromise their integrity.
On the flip side, an ethically sound organization acts like a magnet for talent. It creates a profound positive effect on employee commitment and motivation. In modern knowledge economies, where your primary source of value goes down the elevator every evening, ethical integrity is a massive competitive advantage.
It really is. But declaring a company ethical is easy on a billboard. The reality of management is that executives face complex dilemmas every single day where the right answer isn't black and white.
Exactly. If you have to close a manufacturing plant to save the broader company, there is immense human suffering involved, regardless of the choice. How do leaders navigate those gray areas?
There are 4 distinct philosophical approaches that provide a framework for making decisions when faced with an ethical dilemma. Understanding these is vital for any strategic leader and for your exams. The first is the utilitarian approach.
The classic calculus of morality. Moral behavior is whatever produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people. If closing a plant of 500 people saves the jobs of 5,000 people globally, the utilitarian says you close the plant. You optimize the aggregate outcome.
Right. The second framework is the individualism approach. This is rooted in the idea that acts are moral when they promote the individual's best long-term interests. The underlying philosophy here is that if everyone independently pursues their enlightened long-term self-interest, society as a whole ultimately benefits. It focuses on rational long-term calculation rather than short-term exploitation.
Okay, the third framework completely shifts the focus away from the outcomes and focuses on fundamental human liberties. The moral rights approach. This dictates that an ethically correct decision is one that best maintains the fundamental rights of those affected, regardless of the aggregate benefit.
Exactly. A utilitarian might argue it's acceptable to monitor employees' personal communications if it protects the company's IP and saves the business. The moral rights approach says that violates fundamental liberties.
So what are those liberties specifically?
The framework identifies 6 specific moral rights. First, the right of free consent. Second, the right of privacy. Third, the right of freedom of conscience. Fourth, the right of free speech. Fifth, the right to due process. And sixth, the right to life and safety. If a strategic decision violates any of those rights, it is deemed unethical, full stop.
And the fourth framework is the justice approach. This demands that moral decisions must be based entirely on equity, fairness, and impartiality. It removes the bias from the equation. And this approach breaks down into 4 specific types of justice that managers must uphold.
Let's run through those. First is distributive justice. This is the mandate for equal treatment. Individuals must not be treated differently based on race, sex, religion, or national origin. If 2 people are performing the exact same job with the exact same proficiency, they must receive the same salary.
Second is procedural justice. This requires that the rules themselves be administered fairly and impartially, regardless of who is breaking them. A top-performing executive must face the exact same disciplinary process as an entry-level worker if they violate the same policy.
Third is compensatory justice. This is the principle of restitution. If the company injures an individual, the responsible party must compensate them. Furthermore, it states that individuals cannot be held morally responsible for matters over which they have absolutely no control.
And the fourth type is the natural duty principle. This outlines a fundamental obligation to help others who are in need or danger, a duty to avoid causing unnecessary suffering, and an obligation to comply with the just rules of an institution.
So an executive facing a dilemma can view the problem through the lens of utilitarianism, individualism, moral rights, or justice. But how do you scale that? How do you ensure that middle managers in an office 5,000 miles away are using these frameworks?
You have to build an ethical architecture.
Exactly. You must institutionalize ethics. The framework outlines 9 structural components necessary to build a highly ethical organization. Component 1, as we've noted, is role models. Leadership must visibly take responsibility for ethical lapses. Component 2 is a code of ethics or conduct, which provides the formal, written guidelines for acceptable decision-making.
Component 3 is critical: reward and evaluation systems. If you want to know what a company actually values, look at what they pay for. An ethical evaluation system must consider not just the outcomes achieved, but the means adopted to achieve them.
Right. Because if a manager hits an impossible sales quota, but they did it by systematically lying to customers, and you give them a bonus anyway, you have just institutionalized fraud. You are rewarding the end while ignoring the unethical means.
That is exactly how massive corporate scandals are born. Component 4 is policies and procedures. Ethical ambiguity thrives in a vacuum. You need clear policies, but they must be aggressively enforced and monitored, not just left on an intranet server somewhere.
Component 5 is ethics training, to constantly align employee behavior with the organizational standards. Component 6 is ethics audits. Just as you audit the finances, you must periodically audit departmental behavior to ensure standards are maintained in reality.
Component 7 involves appointing a chief ethics officer. In large, complex organizations, you need a senior executive whose exclusive mandate is acting as a watchdog, overseeing and enforcing ethical conduct.
Component 8 is an ethics committee, usually comprised of senior leaders, designed to deliberate and resolve the most complex, gray area ethical dilemmas that arise.
And Component 9 is an essential safety valve: ethics hotlines. You need a dedicated, secure channel that allows employees to bypass their standard chain of command to report abuses. Because, let's face it, if an employee's direct supervisor is the one demanding unethical behavior, the employee needs a safe, anonymous way to alert senior management without fear of retaliation.
That's a great point. So, we've built an ethical operating system that governs how the company treats its internal members and makes operational decisions. But a company doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in a society. And that transitions us to our fifth and final pillar, corporate social responsibility, or CSR.
If ethics is about doing things right internally, CSR is about the company's relationship with the external world.
CSR shifts the perspective outward. It is defined as actions that appear to further some social good, extending beyond the immediate financial interests of the firm. It encompasses environmental stewardship, community development, charitable initiatives, and the ethical treatment of global supply chains.
But there is a crucial definition here for anyone preparing for an exam. CSR strictly requires firms to go beyond what the law demands. Simply adhering to environmental regulations and labor laws is not CSR. That is just legal compliance. CSR is proactive. It is exceeding the minimum obligations.
To understand the hierarchy of these obligations, we rely on Carroll's 4 responsibilities of a business, structured in order of priority. The foundational layer, responsibility number 1, is economic.
Right. The absolute most basic responsibility of a business is to survive. It must produce goods and services that society wants at a reasonable cost. It must provide jobs, and it must pay its taxes. If a firm does not make a profit, it ceases to exist, and it cannot fulfill any other responsibility.
Exactly. Once survival is secured, responsibility number 2 is legal. The firm has a strict obligation to comply with all laws and regulations, whether that is consumer safety standards or pollution control limits.
Moving up the pyramid, responsibility number 3 is ethical. This is the expected behavior that extends beyond the letter of the law. Society expects a company to operate fairly and justly, even when a specific law doesn't explicitly mandate it.
And at the very top of the pyramid is responsibility number 4, discretionary. These are the entirely voluntary actions a firm takes to act as a good corporate citizen. This includes philanthropic donations, supporting community medical camps, funding public welfare programs, or volunteering employee time.
And here is the exam-critical distinction. When we talk about social responsibility, we are specifically referring to the ethical and discretionary layers. The economic and legal layers are mandatory baselines. CSR is the choice to elevate behavior into the ethical and discretionary realms.
Which invites a deeply cynical but necessary strategic question.
Oh, I like cynical questions. Lay it on me.
If the foundational mandatory goal of a corporation is economic survival and profitability, why on earth should a CEO allocate millions of dollars of shareholder capital to discretionary charities or to engineering a supply chain that is greener than the law requires? Isn't that technically a distraction from their primary economic duty?
It is the classic debate, but modern strategic management firmly counters that view. Engaging in CSR is not a distraction, it is an exercise in enlightened self-interest. The framework provides 5 strategic, financially sound reasons why CSR is vital for a company's long-term success.
Let's break down the business case for CSR. Reason number 1.
First, the self-interest of the organization. A company extracts resources, talent, and infrastructure from the society it operates within. If it acts as a parasite, ignoring the demands of the citizens and the environment, society will eventually reject it. Acknowledging social demands secures the firm's long-term license to operate.
Reason number 2 is purely operational, internal benefits. The data is clear on this. Talk to your talent, especially younger generations. Actively seek out employers whose values align with their own. A robust CSR program is a massive recruiting advantage.
It fosters intense employee pride, which drastically improves workforce retention and morale. Lower turnover means lower training costs and higher productivity. Doing good actually lowers your HR expenses.
Right. Reason number 3 is defensive. It reduces risks. Corporate reputation is intensely fragile. Activist groups, human rights organizations, and environmentally conscious consumers wield massive power. If a company acts irresponsibly, these groups can mobilize boycotts, generate devastating adverse publicity, and tank a company's stock price overnight. Proactive CSR acts as an immunological shield against that kind of activist pressure.
Reason number 4 is arguably the most compelling for the boardroom. It is in the best interest of shareholders. Operating responsibly prevents catastrophic legal and regulatory interventions. Furthermore, pushing for eco-friendly products and sustainable supply chains often forces a company to innovate, reducing waste and increasing energy efficiency.
This can actually enhance the bottom line and increase the likelihood of winning lucrative government or enterprise contracts that mandate sustainability.
And finally, reason number 5, competitive advantage. In crowded markets, a strong corporate image is a profound differentiator. Consumers will actively boycott products deemed environmentally harmful, and they will pay a premium for brands they perceive as socially responsible. Taking the lead in environmental or social issues builds fierce brand loyalty that competitors cannot easily replicate.
So CSR is not philanthropy. It is a sophisticated strategy for long-term survival, risk mitigation, and brand differentiation. It is an investment, not an expense.
Precisely, and that brings us full circle. A strategy cannot survive in a vacuum, it requires an ecosystem.
So let's step back and survey the entire landscape we've mapped out for this implementation journey. We started by mapping the gravitational forces of stakeholder management, recognizing that you have to prioritize influence and establish shared values before you ever try to solve a problem.
We examined the engine of change, strategic leadership. We saw that leading a pivot requires moving beyond transactional management, stepping into transformational territory, and perhaps utilizing the dangerous, igniting fire of charismatic vision to align an organization.
We analyzed the battlefield itself, corporate culture. We understand now that a company's personality has immense spring-back resistance, and that bending it requires great power, visible, aggressive action, and meticulous alignment of stories, rewards, policies, and extreme executive role modeling. We also explored the volatile tightrope of M&A culture clashes, from integration to the hostility of deculturation.
We laid down the operational rules with personal values and ethics. We explored how the utilitarian, individualism, moral rights, and justice frameworks guide complex decision-making, and why those frameworks must be supported by a rigid architecture of codes, audits, and hotlines that reward ethical means, not just profitable ends.
And finally, we looked outward at corporate social responsibility, proving that operating in the enlightened self-interest of society is fundamentally aligned with the long-term competitive advantage of the firm. Mastering how all these pillars interlock is the true secret to mastering behavioral implementation.
If you are preparing for your exams, you must understand the tension between these pillars. They do not always align perfectly.
And that brings me to a final provocative thought for you to consider as you continue your MBA prep. We spent a significant amount of time discussing how corporate culture is deeply resistant to change, and how it requires immense power from the top down to overcome it. We also discussed how a charismatic leader can ignite a fire that causes followers to transcend their own self-interest.
But place that reality next to the ethical frameworks we just outlined.
Exactly. Consider this tension. At what point does a transformational leader's aggressive use of great power to reshape a problem culture cross the line into violating the moral rights approach?
Specifically, the right to free consent and the freedom of conscience. If an acquiring CEO forcefully imposes a deculturation on an acquired firm, intentionally breaking down their historical norms, causing massive stress and resentment to force compliance, can that CEO still claim to be operating an ethical organization based on justice and moral rights?
It is the ultimate contradiction. When does a visionary strategy mandate unethical force? How much collateral human damage is a utilitarian willing to accept to save the larger enterprise?
That gray area, the intersection of power, culture, and ethics, is where true strategic management lives, and it is a fascinating place to explore. Because you can formulate the most mathematically perfect strategy on Earth, but until you can navigate the gravity of stakeholders, bend the culture, lead the people, and do it all without losing your ethical compass, you haven't really done anything at all. You just have a blueprint blowing in the wind. Thanks for exploring the muddy waters with us on this deep dive. Good luck with the preparation, and keep questioning the frameworks.